I think there are probably kind of three reasons. One is the strength of neoliberal ideology. This was a crisis. This was an ideological crisis in 2008, 2009. The idea of hyper-efficient, self-correcting markets was shown to be false, which was the underpinnings of neoliberalism, and many people, including ourselves, thought that would be the death knell of that kind of thinking. But it's proved to be very strong in terms of its ability to survive. The meeting that we are having, the summer school we are having, of course, is being jointly organized with INET. And INET was established immediately after the crisis because it was felt that economics had failed and it did not understand the kinds of dynamics that had been unleashed over the past 30 years, and we needed to think about economics differently. And there's talk about new curricula in universities to bring in the kind of things that have traditionally been ignored by conventional economic thinking, and it really hasn't happened. So neoliberalism has proved a much more robust ideology than many of us thought. I think the other one, of course, ultimately is that, you know, those people that have benefited from the last 30 years of hyperglobalization have not only retained their power base, but they've in many respects strengthened their capture of the political process. So, and we've talked a lot about this in recent work that we've done in UNCTAD, the idea of a Medici vicious circle. That is how economic power has been able to capture political processes to reinforce its economic power. And again, we thought that would be disrupted by the crisis, but when we look at the last 10 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, that Medici vicious circle has, if anything, become even more vicious than it was in the run-up to the crisis. And you can see that in Europe, for example, in the failure of those political parties that one would expect to present an alternative, the classical European social democratic parties, to come up with alternative solutions, alternative responses to these problems of inequality and instability and indebtedness. And they failed, essentially, and part of the reason that they failed, that they have been captured by corporate interests too, I think. And the final reason, I think, for this lack of change is actually with the developing countries. Because in the immediate period after the crisis, developing countries, interestingly, recovered much more quickly than the developed countries. And there was a certain sense that they were no longer subject to the pressures coming out of the developing world. There was lots of talk in the IMF about developing countries having decoupled their growth from what was going on in the advanced economies, that they had their new internal growth dynamics. The BRICS were becoming the big drivers of economic growth worldwide. And there was a certain complacency in the developing world that they were doing okay and that they didn't really need to think about alternatives. Of course, they were doing okay in part because of the kind of policy responses that were taking place in the advanced economies to deal with their problems, namely the huge pumping in of liquidity by central banks into their economies, some of which spilled out into the developing world and added a certain growth momentum to these economies. So they hadn't decoupled at all, that actually their growth was highly dependent on the policy choices in the advanced economies. And we now see, as some of those policies in the advanced economies are changing, just how vulnerable developing countries actually are. Again, Argentina, Turkey, South Africa, we're seeing these problems now. But they were complacent at the time. And so again, another group that could have been pushing for change of the international system really did not come up with alternatives. So there was a set of pressures, the ideological, political, economic, that have kind of prevented alternatives actually emerging in the last 10 years. And we're back to where we were in the 2000s.